Welcome to the TCA's history lesson, which will show you how to complete a piece of extended writing on the Black Death. You should have already completed a starter as part of the live lesson on Microsoft Teams. Let's make a start on the lesson. Remember to pause the video to give yourself time to complete the tasks. Over the past few lessons, you have looked at the Black Death and the impact that this had on medieval Britain. Open your books and have your notes on the Black Death in front of you. I'm going to go over the events of the Black Death and the impact that it had. Whilst I am doing this, read through your notes and listen to the recap as it is happening. The Black Death was an epidemic disease. This means that it was a major outbreak that spread rapidly to a lot of people. All the conditions in medieval Britain were ripe for a plague. Doctors were powerless against infectious diseases. People's medical knowledge was also limited at this time. People had been weakened by war and the harvest failure, which contributed to the impact the Black Death had. The Black Death spread through animals such as rats to humans from the fleas that the animals carried. The fleas carried the germs which caused the Black Death to spread. This was made worse by how dirty the towns and villages were. Remember, in medieval Britain, there was no running water or toilets for that matter. Waste was chucked into the streets where people walked, shopped, and cut up food. These dirty conditions helped the Black Death spread quickly. Busy trade routes also carried the plague from one place to another. The plague arrived in England in June 1348 in Dorset and quickly spread throughout the rest of England. By 1349 it had reached Wales and the north of England. By 1350 it had made its way to Scotland. It didn't start to fade away until the 1350s. The Black Death first started in Asia, which was called the East in medieval Britain. Estimates suggest that as much as half of the population of Europe was affected. The Black Death affected all people throughout life, as it affected different people in society, whether you were royalty or a peasant. Today we know that there were many causes of the Black Death, such as poor medical knowledge and the rats which were spreading the disease. But people in 1348 didn't know how the Black Death started, so they had many different ideas as to what caused it. Medical doctors were not certain what caused the plague, but believed it could be a result of the movement of the planets, a punishment from God, bad smells and corrupt air, enemies who had poisoned the wells, staring at a victim, or the body's humours being out of balance. This idea of the humours stemmed from Roman and Greek ideas that the body was made up of humours, which are a specific fluid known as black bile, yellow bile, blood and phlegm. If one of these humours was out of balance, then this is what made you become ill. Again, due to limited medical knowledge, there was many different cures for the plague, such as smelling herbs and spices, keeping away from other people, whipping yourself, and putting frogs on the buboes. The Black Death had a huge effect on medieval Britain. Estimates differ, but most historians believe that the Black Death killed half the population of Europe. In some places, like the village of West Thickley in County Durham, it killed everybody. The effects of the Black Death can be split up into 4 categories. Social, to do with people, political, to do with running the country, economic, to do with money, and finally religious, to do with the church. The social impact of the Black Death was huge, as about 33% of Wales and England's population died. It took over 250 years for the population to recover. Peasants began to hate their poverty, especially in comparison to the barons. This helped destroy the feudal system. However, the social impact of the plague wasn't all bad. Medical knowledge improved as doctors were allowed to study corpses and towns became cleaner. The Black Death had a big impact politically. Not only did the feudal system become weaker, but harsh laws were introduced to try and stop the freedom and improvements of peasants' lives. In terms of religion, a new movement called the Lollards emerged. They believed that churchmen should live simple lives and that the Bible should be translated into English. People were angry and bitter, and they blamed the church. In great numbers, they began supporting the Lollard movement. Finally, the economic impact of the Black Death was not only big but long-lasting. As so many people died, this led to a shortage of workers, and when Parliament passed laws to stop wages rising, the peasants were angry, and this led to the Peasants' Revolt. Now that we have recapped our knowledge on the Black Death, we are going to attempt an extended piece of writing. We want to build on your historical skills, and this is going to be the first time you have used sources, so we expect you to evaluate evidence and come to a reasoned judgment about how useful a source is. Using sources is a key historical skill. We need to be able to interpret the information that is within the source and evaluate whether or not the source is useful in studying a particular topic. Today's extended writing task is going to be all about source work. We are going to use sources to help us come to a reasoned judgment about the impact that the Black Death had on medieval Britain. I'm going to walk you through how to approach this extended writing task, as well as show you how to interpret a source. Before we can look at the sources and start to think about the structure of this extended piece of writing, we need to consider what should we think about when we are evaluating whether a source is useful or not. How do we break down what the source is trying to tell us? Firstly, we need to look at the content of the source. So what is the source telling us? For this, you need to read through the source and think of what is it trying to say. Pick out key phrases that you are going to use in your answer that shows us the point that the source is making. Secondly, you need to think, does the source tell us anything that is useful? For this part, you need to use your own knowledge on the subject. For us, it is the Black Death. Does the source support the knowledge that you already have? Does this make the source useful then for understanding the impact that the Black Death had? Once we put all of this together, this is how we evaluate whether a source is useful. I'm going to talk you through the structure of this piece of extended writing. You are going to evaluate two sources which will amount to 3 paragraphs. Paragraph 1 covers source A, paragraph 2 covers source B, and paragraph 3 is your conclusion, where you summarise both sources and make a decision about which one is more useful than the other. I'm now going to break down how you will approach the sources in each paragraph. In paragraph 1 and 2, you should include the following in your paragraphs. Why is the content useful? Does it support your own knowledge about the Black Death? And overall, how useful is the source? To show you what I'm looking for, I'm going to go through an example with you and give you an example paragraph. So our question is, how useful is this source for understanding the impact of the Black Death? We are going to annotate this source together. Then we are going to write an example paragraph using the slow writing technique. Here is our example source. I will read through it first. Millions of workers died from the Black Death, resulting in a labour shortage. Surviving workers were able to demand higher wages. In the countryside, many serfs and free peasants simply left the farms in search of better opportunities, or were able to extract concessions from their superiors. Firstly, there's a few words in here that we might not understand, such as serfs. That's another word for peasant. Concessions is meaning that you are trying to get something from someone. In this context, the peasants are trying to get more from the barons. Let's break down the context then of this particular source. Let's take the first bit. Millions of workers died from the Black Death, resulting in a labour shortage. From our own knowledge, we know that in England and Wales, 33% of the population died. This is what led to the labour shortage because so many people perished during the Black Death. If we look at the next bit, surviving workers were able to demand higher wages. Again, using our own knowledge, we know that wages increased 400% after the Black Death, and this was due to the shortages of workers. Here you can see we have picked out content from the source and we have added our own knowledge to support it. Final one. Many serfs and free peasants simply left the farms in search of better opportunities. We know that the feudal system meant that the peasants needed permission from their barons if they wanted to leave the village. So here we can see that the peasants are acting against the feudal system. All of the information that we have picked out from the source makes the source useful for studying the impact of the Black Death. It is useful because we know how many people died. We also know that wages increased, and we know that the feudal system was abolished after the Black Death. Therefore, this makes this source useful for studying the impact that the Black Death had. Now that we have broken the source down, I'm going to show you how we put that together in a paragraph using the slow writing technique. First, I need to introduce you to the slow writing technique. This is where you are giving a structure, and each sentence needs to be a very specific thing. For example, sentence 1. Here you must give one detail/example from the source. Then, sentence 2 must start with the phrase, this is useful or not useful because. Sentence 3 must use a piece of own knowledge about the impact of the Black Death. You want to put at least one piece of own knowledge here, however, if you have more than one, that is even better. Sentence 4 must make a quick judgment on how useful the source has been for studying the impact of the Black Death. I will now break down what I mean with these sentences. For example, sentence number 1, you must give one detail and example from the source. What this means is you need to pick out a phrase from the source and write it in your paragraph, explaining what it means. Sentence 2, you must start the sentence with this is useful/not useful because. This is where you are summing up, is the source useful or not in studying the impact of the Black Death. Sentence 3, this is where you add your own knowledge. So anything you know about the Black Death that you can put with this source goes here. And finally, sentence 4, this is where you make a quick judgment about how useful the source has been for studying the impact of the Black Death. So you say here, overall, I think the source has been useful or has not been useful, depending on what your opinion is. I am now going to talk you through an example paragraph using the slow writing technique. Remember, sentence 1 must give a detail/example from the source. So here I've written, the source shows us that the Black Death had an impact on how many workers there were, which meant that the surviving workers were able to demand a higher wage. You can see here that I have directly quoted from the source. I've used the same language that the source does. This is what I mean by give one detail from the source. Sentence number 2. The sentence here must start with this is useful/not useful. Let's have a look at the practice paragraph. This is useful as it shows us that the Black Death had a big impact economically and peasants could earn more money. What I have done here is I have looked at the points that I have made above and I have explained why this is useful for understanding the impact the Black Death had. We know that surviving workers were able to demand a higher wage. Therefore, this makes the source useful because we know that the peasants could earn more money after the Black Death. Sentence 3 must include a piece of own knowledge about the Black Death and the impact that it had. Remember, you can add more than one piece of own knowledge for this. As you can see here, I have started the sentence with using my own knowledge to make it really clear that I am including my own knowledge. Using my own knowledge, I know that in England and Wales, 33% of the population died, which explains the shortage of workers. Finally, sentence 4, I need to make a quick judgment about how useful the source has been for studying the Black Death. You can see that I have started with the word overall. This is a good way to show that you are summarising. I have said overall this source is useful for showing the impact that the Black Death had. Quick, simple and to the point. I have said that yes, this source is useful. This would be an example paragraph using the slow writing technique. You can see that I have colour coded it, so you can see that purple relates to sentence 1, orange relates to sentence 2, green relates to sentence 3, and blue relates to sentence 4. This is how you are going to write your paragraph. We're going to spend a minute discussing each source that you are going to use for your extended piece of writing. Make sure you're listening clearly because I'm going to break down the knowledge that you could add to these sources. Source A. For peasants who survived the Black Death, these were good times. Prices were low and wages were high. They were not afraid to stand up for themselves against the barons, the lords, the church, and even the king. Perhaps the disaster had something to do with this. So many died that those who were left felt special in some way. So this source is talking about the people who survived were enjoying life after the Black Death. Prices were low and wages were high. We know that wages increased after the Black Death because there was such a shortage of workers. That can be the own knowledge that we add here. And then the source goes on to talk about how the peasants weren't afraid to stand up for themselves, particularly the church. We know that here there was a religious movement called the Lollards that started to become more prevalent after the Black Death. You could reference this here in your annotations. Let's move on to source B then. It is very difficult for us to imagine the impact on these small rural communities where a village might have had no more than 400 or 500 inhabitants. Few settlements were totally depopulated, but in most others, whole families must have been wiped out, and few can have been spared some loss, since the plague killed the rich and the poor alike. Our knowledge that we would add here is where it says that few settlements were totally depopulated. We can use the example of the village in County Durham where everybody died. We can also say where it says that few can have been spared such a loss. We can use that statistic that we know that in England and Wales, 33% of the population died. We can also add some treatments into this as well. We can say that there was few treatments around so that many people did not survive because they did not have a good treatment to spare themselves from the plague. Now that I have broken down these two sources, you are going to have a go at reading them. Now you are going to write your answer. The two sources are at the top of the page. Read through them and think about what you are going to pick out and how you are going to approach this. At the bottom of the page, I have given you the slow writing technique. Remember, sentence 1 must give one detail and example from the source. Sentence 2 must start with this is useful / not useful because. Sentence 3 must use a piece of own knowledge about the impact of the Black Death. Remember, you can add more than one if you want to. And sentence 4 must make a quick judgment about how useful it is for the impact of the Black Death. Keep this on your screen so that you can have the two sources in front of you and the structure of how to write the paragraphs at the bottom.